this is Jared from Commit to Quality, and in this video, we're going to show you how you can use variables inside a test. Now, before we get started, I do want to say if you haven't watched the previous video, I'd strongly suggest going to watch that because it shows how we set up our basic test. However, this video is going to focus on creating, getting and clearing global, collection and environment variables, and also give you some quick examples of how they're used across the board. Let's jump right into this. We're using the test example we set up from the last video, and we can use snippets again. Like I said in the previous video, these are really useful. If you don't see it, just click this arrow and the snippets will already be out for you, will slide out for you. And inside here, the first things you really see is snippets of how to set variables. So let's focus on global variables because they have the easiest scope where everything can access this. So what I'm doing here is I've clicked the snippet, which has created this line of code, which is pm.globals.set, which is essentially saying create a global variable for me. So let's change the key name to commit quality, and we'll set the value to subscribe. Now, what this means is when I execute this, you won't see anything. You won't even see anything in the console. But what's happened is, as part of this now, this global variable called commit quality with a value of subscribe is being created, which means anything inside our Postman workspace can have access to this because it's completely global. I can even say, let's go down and we can say get a global variable, which is pm.globals.get. If I pass through, instead of variable key, commit quality, I'm going to output console.log so you can just see something in the console a minute. So console.log, and then it's getting that variable. So now when I hit send, what we should see in this console is the value of subscribe being output. So let's hit send, and subscribe is being output. Perfect. Now, there's not real much use of using this just directly in one test because you're setting it globally. So what we can do now is, if you've been following the video, you probably have multiple collections already created. But if you haven't, just create an API request outside of the JSON placeholder collection. So I'm going to use the board API example. And inside here, I'm going to try and access commit quality variable, and this should all work. So now what we should see is once I've executed this test, which of course sets the variable, when I then send this request, we should be able to retrieve subscribe again. So let's clear this down. We've already set the global variable. Let's hit send. And there we are. Subscribe has been returned, and you can see we're actually executing a completely different API call. So in this one, we contacting the JSON placeholder posts endpoint. But in this one, we're actually using the board API URL and trying to get an activity. So that's a quick example of how you can access these in different tests. And you might even see that if you want to combine kind of requests from different collections, this is a way of how you can set variables and pass values through for extra in-depth testing. Now, we can also clear variables as well. If I go to snippets, just to make this easier, because you don't have to type this out yourself, you can say clear a global variable, and all you have to do is replace the placeholder of variable key with whatever key you want to unset. And now in this example, what we're going to see, if I copy this console.log, clear this, what we're actually going to see is subscribe will be output on this console.log, but then we clear in this value. So for this console.log, we shouldn't see the value of subscribe anymore. What we should see is undefined, because that's JavaScript's way of telling us that there is no key. It's undefined. There's no value associated with it. So let's hit send on this. And here we are, you've got subscribe and undefined. And what you may also be thinking is, but what happens to this one now if we execute this? And it's going to be exactly the same. It's going to say undefined because the last thing we did on this request was unset commit quality. So let's clear this down, send this board API request, and there we are. We've got it set as undefined because we've cleared it here in line 3 of this request. So that's one thing you will be very careful of when you're kind of clearing your variables down, especially global ones, is if other request tests are working off the assumption there will be a value in the variable, you can cause a lot of problems. And that's why sometimes global variables can be more effort than you really need to deal with. So that's globals. But the next I want to go over is collection variables. So let's just, we'll get rid of all of it here. And now I'm going to go back to snippets and I'm going to say set a collection variable. And the difference between this one and the global is we won't have access to this variable anywhere outside of my JSON placeholder collection. So the example we'll do now is we'll add a new key called, what should I call it? Video. Don't know why I'm calling it video. And we'll just put the value as like. Now, if I go into this board API request, which remember is outside of the JSON placeholder collection, if I say get a collection variable and take the key of video, of course, I need to wrap this in a console.log as well. Here we go. But what you're going to see now is this is going to be undefined again. So let's clear the console. And that's because it's outside of the collection. But what happens when, let's clear this down, I copy this line of code and put it into any one of these other requests. Let's just pick on this get request and go to tests. If I paste that in here and hit send, what we see is the value for video has been picked up because we're inside this collection. And once again, you can do the same thing of clearing the collection variable just by simply saying dot unset like we did. So I can do that, hit send. Okay, nothing's output at this point because we don't have any console logs. But if I go to this JSON placeholder where it did output the like, hit send now, and it's cleared it down to undefined because that's what we did in this first example. And the last one I want to show you is the environment variable. So let's get rid of these and set an environment variable. Well, I'll just, in this one, I'll name the key of subscribe and the value of yes, please. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button because it really does help me out a lot. But in this case, this applies now to whatever environment you've set. So we've been working off no environment at the moment, but let's say we're in the JSON placeholder production environment. If I hit send on this, of course, we're not going to see anything down in the console because there's no console.log. But it doesn't matter where I am now, as long as we have this environment selected, we'll be able to access this subscribe variable, which I actually misspelt as well. So I'll have to copy that to make sure that it works. So if I go to this board API request, which is outside of the collection, I can say get an environment variable. Let's cut that inside this console.log. And I'm going to copy this because of my typo. Hit send. Oh, we don't want the semicolon there. So hit send, and what you're going to see now is yes, please. But if I change to JSON placeholder test, which is a different environment I have, and hit send, it's undefined because we haven't executed this test yet, which was set into subscribe inside this environment. So if I then hit send on this one, clear everything down and go back to here, now we should see yes, please is output. And that's because we're using these two different variables. And once again, you can unset these just by saying unset on here with whatever the key name is. The same example, just instead of saying pm.global, or we using pm.environment. So let's just close everything for a minute to make things a little bit more simple. And I kind of want to show you how a real world example would work. Now, we do need to remember that this JSON placeholder is a dummy API. So when I'm doing these posts, nothing is really happening behind the scenes. It's spitting out some response, but we're not updating this anywhere. So you've got to kind of use your imagination a little bit on this. But what we could do is when we're creating a post request, we want to say, right, we've done the post, but then we want to call the get request to make sure that the resource has been created. What I could say is, obviously, this is living inside the same collection. So I could say collection variable set user ID. And we could say that value can be, if I put const res above the top, up here, I could say the value is res dot ID. Let's just console log that out to make sure it's working. So I'll say console.log pm.collectionVariables.get of user. Oh, forget the string quotes, user ID. Save that. I'm going to go to my console, clear everything down, just hit send. And oh, that hasn't set anything. It's because of my typo again. It's not used, it's user. Hit send, and we can see 101 is generated here. Now what we can do is, if this was a kind of real API flow, we could go to this get request, and in post we could say user variable, and you can see it's already here. You can see user ID is the one we just set of collection. We can hit send on this, and what you can see now is on this new request on get, we are saying, get me back the user ID of 101, which is what we set in this. Now, in a real world example, I would have expected the response here to contain the details that we set here. So like title of commit quality, body of subscribe, and everything else. Oh, I actually set up the user ID to ID instead of user ID, which is why we had 101 as well. But you can see what I'm talking about here, and you can then create your requests off this, and then you can go into tests, and you could maybe return that collection variable. So I could say user ID there, and that would output 101 at this point as well. Go down 101 at that point. And this is just kind of a flow to get you into thinking why we're going to use these variables. So like say a real API, you're creating your resource, you're then going in to check it. You could then even add it to your delete, where you could pass through the collection variable or even global or whatever you set in here just by using the two squigglies. You can basically do whatever you want with these variables. So then what you're doing is you're doing a full kind of end-to-end process of all your kind of CRUD options. So it's just really useful to know this kind of stuff. In the next video, just a little spoiler, we're going to go over dynamic variables, so we can use kind of Postman's fake-in tools to create kind of sample data on the fly for us, something really useful and really worth knowing. So please drop a subscribe so you can stay tuned for the next video. As always, any questions, please drop them below. Thank you for watching and have a good day.